Hey everyone, I'm Thanos Davelis, your host here at the Greek Current Cafe. In a now famous 1941 speech, President Franklin Roosevelt outlined the 4 fundamental freedoms everyone around the world deserves to enjoy. Number 2 on that list was religious freedom. Today, as the latest report by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom states, authoritarian regimes and groups, from entities in Syria to Turkey and China, are putting this freedom at risk, and the ripple effect goes well beyond their borders. Can we reverse this trend? We'll be digging into that and more with our guests today, Ambassador Sam Brownback, Nadine Manza, Elizabeth Prodromou, and Tuba Tanyeri Erdemir. It's great to have you all on the Greek Current Cafe, and I think with that, we'll dive right in. Ambassador Brownback, I'd like to kick off with you here. You just got back from a trip to Iraq. As the country looks to turn a page on, wars from the previous decades, is this one of the places that you're looking at as, a ground zero potentially for religious freedom issues right now?
This was my most encouraging trip I've ever had to Iraq, and I've been there a number of times in various positions. But now I was in the northern part in the Kurdish region. It was in Erbil, but the place is growing. The religious minority population is growing. Christians and Yazidis, they're protected. It's really proving the point that a number of us have made for a long time, that if you will guarantee religious freedom, you'll have more prosperity and more peace. And they're doing that. I hope it actually is a case study that people start looking at. And here it's in a tough region. It's right next to Iran, that's doing all sorts of religious persecution. And in a lot of the rest of Iraq, there's religious persecution where your religious minority population have just been driven out. I hope it is a good case study in proving the point.
Nadine, you also were in the region recently, and you just got back from Syria, where, despite promises of reform from Syria's new Islamist turned president, many minorities still fear retribution. Based on what you saw and what you've worked on in the past as a USERF commissioner, how precarious is the situation for these minorities right now?
Yeah, I'll tell you, most Syrians are tired of war, violence, poverty, all the things that it brings. And most want to live in peace with their neighbors. But of course, the religious minority communities are feeling especially vulnerable right now. So, of course, we had mass violence against the Alawites in March, against the Druze just this last week. And then even the last day, we've seen reports of security forces storming 2 restaurants in Damascus that serve alcohol, people actually being killed in the restaurants. So, as you mentioned, President al-Shara has a well-documented terrorist past. But most do see him as a pragmatist who wants Syria to succeed. But his own security forces have been involved in so much of this violence that it is troubling for all the religious communities. And I feel like trust is waning in this government for that reason. And, the security forces include not only the HTS Islamist forces that came with him, but foreign fighters. I've seen a list of about 15,000 from all these different countries, in addition to the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army that is, many of them have been sanctioned by the U.S. government for their horrific violations of religious freedom and human rights, and yet they are all part of this Syrian security forces. So yeah, there really is a lot of anxiety. I was just in Northeast Syria last week. A couple months ago, I was in Damascus and kind of heard very similar stories of hope and anxiety at the same time.
Elizabeth, I want to turn to you. Having also served as a USERF commissioner and worked on religious freedom issues extensively, why does getting this issue right in Syria matter so much? Not just individual liberties, but when we look at the geopolitical angle as well.
Well, I think the geography of Syria on the Eastern Med, with access to the entire Mediterranean basin, it's a major trade entrepot from the rest of the Mediterranean into the Near East. It's also been a point of north-south migration in the region. But I think, there's a longer history where this offers a moment to maybe get things right. I mean, the confessionalization of Syria and of Syrian nationalism really dates back to the French Mandate period, because it was under the French Mandate that the country was organized for administrative purposes into sectarian zones. And it's the consolidation of that sectarianism, even after the French left in 1943 to 46, that was then utilized and weaponized under the Assad dynasty from Hafiz al-Assad in the 60s up through his son Bashar. So I think this is a moment to break a pattern. And so there's a larger project at work here, which is that of creating a Syrian nationalism that includes all of the faith communities and people who have no faith at all. And that would serve as an example, I think, for the region, for the greater Middle East, at a time globally as well, where there's a tendency to confessionalize national identities, and especially under authoritarian leaders, that gets weaponized then vis-a-vis minority communities. And I would like to say, following on Nadine's point, number one, if we use the term minority, we're talking about numerical minorities, because in the case of Syria, the Christian community has been there since the origins of Christianity. One of the oldest patriarchates in the world is the Patriarchate of Antioch, now absorbed into Turkey, but relocated to Damascus. So we're talking about numerical minorities, and there's a reason for the small number of those communities. And so we can come back to that. But the final thing is the concern about the lack of representation of Druze, Christians, and Alawites in this new transitional government. And I think that's a real red flag, as well as the inclusion of some of the perpetrators of crimes from the THS, Al-Qaeda, ISIS that are now part of the cabinet. So these are red flags to be watching for early on in this process.
Tuba, zooming out a bit from Syria to cover the broader region, including, Turkey, the Caucasus, what do you see as a key here to ensuring that minority communities across the region can not only feel safe, but thrive? And I want to tap into your work here that you've done on, task forces for minorities in the region with ADL and others.
I want to talk a little bit about fear. And this is not, obviously there is a fear in a lot of ethnic, religious minorities that they will face persecution or they will be violently attacked. But I want to talk about something much deeper. And the murdered Turkish Armenian journalist Hrant Dink defined this as the trepidations of a dove. This is the fear that you choose not to name your child in alignment with your religion, or this is the fear that you tell your children not to speak your mother tongue in crowds. This is the fear that you might tell yourself or your kid not to wear a cross or a Star of David. So this is kind of like a very deeply ingrained fear that many authoritarian regimes feed upon. And not only they use this fear to hurt these societies on a daily basis, but it is the base of making them captive communities. They, at one point, become communities that cannot defend themselves, that cannot speak up for themselves at the fear of much larger attacks and violence. So in order for us, all of us, to survive and thrive, we have to be fighting this fear every day, and all of us. And we need to be braver than we've ever been.
Ambassador, with that in mind, I want to turn back to you, because many of these minority communities, especially the Christian ones, just celebrated Easter, and the same, just a day after Pope Francis passed away, who was a tireless advocate for religious freedom in this region, and in fact had visited the region as well. As early as November, he told a delegation from Tehran visiting the Vatican that, and I'm going to quote him here, freedom of conscience and religion is the cornerstone of the entire edifice of human rights. In your view, then, is this the key to unlocking all the other rights and freedoms?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is the cornerstone. This is the most personal. This is the deepest of freedoms. And it's also the toughest one to get right. Mm-hmm. But once you can set the cornerstone correctly, you can build these other freedoms off of it. Indeed, I think we need to relaunch the Global Human Rights Project, get it back to the UN Charter of 48, those basic human rights that everybody agreed to in 1948. and just say, this is the community of them. The one we're going to focus on to get right at the very outset is religious freedom. And we're going to build then the freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of press off of that. And I really think that's what the world needs to do today.
Well, Ambassador, you mentioned this is maybe the hardest of the freedoms to safeguard. Why do you think that is?
It's easily manipulated. It's easy to attack. It's easy to motivate people to attack minority religious communities. It's the most used tool to create genocide in a country. It's one that, while it reaches for God, it's easiest to manipulate by mankind. It's the kingdom of man trying to subdue the kingdom of God, and it's been used for centuries.
Elizabeth, I want to turn to you here, because beyond viewing religious as a human rights issue, should we also consider it within the broader framework of global politics, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's as part of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, where we've seen tensions, at least in our community, with the ecumenical patriarch at the forefront of that, in China, elsewhere?
Absolutely, Thano. I think that it's important not to silo freedom of conscience, belief, or religion. And just look at all of us on this screen. We all have expertise in religious freedom and human rights, but many of us also interact regularly with the security communities, with the economic development community. And so I think one of the things that, at least if we're talking about U.S. foreign policy, that where the U.S. needs to do a better job and can do a better job, and therefore stand as an example, is have more of a whole of government approach, and to recognize that the foundational freedoms that Ambassador Brownback mentioned, freedom of thought, conscience, belief, and religion, related to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, property rights regimes that treat all citizens equally before the law, the right to education, and the right to be free from both violence and, as also, as Tuba said, the fear of violence, the kind of invisible forms of discrimination that nonetheless have a really deleterious effect on people's everyday lives. So I think in terms of a whole of government approach, we need more active and robust cooperation between the security, religious freedom, and human rights communities, also with the public health community. Faith communities can deliver really important services when it comes to complex global public health issues, and also on climate change. You mentioned His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. He's been awarded the Templeton Prize for his work on stewarding the natural environment since his tenure beginning in the early 1990s. So that kind of whole of government approach that recognizes that religious freedom isn't some sort of niche issue, that if you can't have freedom of conscience, if you can't have freedom of belief, the freedom to change your belief, whether it's religious or non-religious, you will not have those other freedoms that intersect organically with religious freedom.
Elizabeth, I want to stick with you as a follow-up here. You've contributed to publications like the Kremlin's Playbook with CSIS, and there we've seen how Russia and the Kremlin manipulates religious freedom and religion to serve its purposes. Can you just kind of touch on that for our audience?
Great. I think that in terms of this Faustian bargain between Patriarch Kirill of the Moscow Patriarchate and Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, we see the worst kind of church state or religion state collaboration and cooperation for purposes of religious conformity and majoritarianism domestically, and for the weaponization of religion for the committing violence in terms of foreign policy. And there are numerous examples of that all over the world. But I think because of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, it offers a really tragic learning moment for the international community to think about the different kinds of arrangements between church and state or religion and state that can either enable religious freedom or combat or reduce religious freedom. And again, this is, I think, one of the worst cases that we've seen in recent times, but it's by no means the only case. And I think one of the other issues that we see when it comes to the Kremlin Patriarchate of Moscow relationship is the way that geopolitics and religious nationalism intersect. And alas, around the world, I think we see more and more use of religion for nationalism purposes. Going back to what I mentioned about Syria, the way that religion can be used for majoritarian forms of nationalism, not forms of nationalism that work according to what we call the prevailing religion formula, which we see all over Europe and in terms of religion state arrangements, but nationalisms that are specifically designed in order to create a hierarchy of equality or second and third classedness before the state. So what we're seeing in the Russian case is a perfect example of an ugly phenomenon that's global.
Nadine, I want to turn to you because in its latest annual report, USERF made the case that now more than ever, U.S. support for the right to freedom of religion or belief has to remain a priority as both a strategic national interest and a reflection of, American national identity. Is this something you think is sinking in with policymakers in Washington, especially considering how you're in and out of the Hill all the time?
I would say yes and no. So yes, in the sense that people do agree that religious freedom matters, and speaking about it on this top tier is embraced and comfortable. So people all agree, yes, religious freedom is important. But as Elizabeth mentioned, it's really that the siloing of religious freedom that often happens, which is when we're talking big picture, let's talk about religious freedom, but when we're talking about a specific country, let's push it aside right now because we have other urgent matters to deal with. But what's happening is you can't have that long-term peace and stability without it. So when it's excluded from these short-term discussions, these short-term wins we're looking at, that's when we're running into these problems. And so I think often the struggle is both being siloed from the important discussions, but also those short-term wins being put ahead of long-term peace and stability. Use Turkey as a perfect example. The U.S. often needs Turkey for some short-term deal, some short-term political win. So they overlook the religious freedom violations, even though Turkey's own actions are undermining the U.S.'s own mission in some places like Syria. So this is a bipartisan problem. We've seen this through multiple administrations. So at the end of the day, we have to integrate religious freedom into foreign policy and consider the impact different decisions are going to have on religious freedom for that country or the countries that are involved with it, and what that will mean for U.S. interests. And oftentimes, if we took a step back and looked at it in a bigger way, there would be some adjustments to how policy was being implemented that would have a positive effect on U.S. policy, ultimately because it would have a positive effect on religious freedom. So I do think we need to relook at how we consider religious freedom in foreign policy.
Ambassador, was this one of the challenges that you had to face when you were serving your tenure on international religious freedom?
It was. You were often fighting just to get a seat at the table, but that is changing. I mean, now it's given a seat at the table. I just don't think it's quite seen as the priority yet. I mean, to play off of what Nadine said, to me, it's you're going into surgery and your body needs a fixing, but you come out and you got to have a good diet or you're going to die. And religious freedom is just kind of the basic dietary issues. You got to have this to maintain a healthy society, or your things are going to go wrong into the future.
And I will add that I just was invited to the State Department this last week to talk about the implication on religious freedom. And so I have seen more of that open door, which is, we're trying to figure things out. So let's have someone come in to help us make sure we're considering this. And that's a win. And whenever we have that opportunity to help recast how religious freedom could impact the situation and have them want to listen and consider how that could fit in is a win. So yeah, I definitely see some positive openings, but it's one of those things we're going to have to keep fighting for.
Tuba, as we fight for this issue, something that we've spoken about many times in the past is the importance of the link between cultural heritage and minority rights and religious freedom. Why is this a key piece of the puzzle?
Going back to Ambassador Brownback's point about getting back to human rights, I am a firm believer that right to heritage is a human right as well. And let me explain why this is the case. Cultural heritage of all sorts, is our strongest link to our past, and it's our one commodity that is very important to pass on to future. It's like our communal memory is embedded in cultural heritage. And within that large spectrum of cultural heritage, there is the sacred heritage is also a very, very important part. Again, it goes back to defining communities and their faiths and how they have changed through time. And you can use cultural heritage to build an inclusive society, but you can also use it to weaponize too. So this is an issue that we need to think a lot more about. This requires a lot more careful investigation, and it needs to be talked more, and by the international community as well.
Elizabeth, picking up on Tuba's point here, one place where we've seen a pattern of cultural heritage, destruction in our wider region is the occupied northern part of Cyprus. We've talked a lot about Hagia Sophia, Hora Church that are in Istanbul, but is this story, the story of the occupied part of Cyprus, something that should rank much higher on, any religious freedom reports, especially those of USCIRF and the State Department?
Absolutely, Thano. I think I looked at this most recent USCIRF report, and I think the lack of focus on occupied Cyprus is a huge deficit in the short section on Turkey. And this applies anywhere around the world in which there are occupation regimes. Occupation regimes have responsibilities under international law, and Turkey has certainly violated its responsibilities in occupied Cyprus. And I think one of the spaces where we can most see that is in terms of their quite systematic destruction of cultural heritage. And if you look at going to Tuva's point about heritage can either be weaponized or used as a point for reconciliation and social integration, I think the Turkish approach has certainly been to weaponize. And it's part of the broader strategy of using both tangible cultural heritage and the intangible forms of heritage that go along with the physicality or the tangible forms of heritage as a means of homogenization. In occupied Cyprus, it's interesting that both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots surveyed across the island have consistently ranked the preservation of cultural heritage as a priority for them. I think recognizing that in terms of the ability to share space, and after all, that's what we're talking about in the region we're discussing, but more broadly, the ability to live with difference and to live with difference in a way that is nonviolent and that's respectful. So heritage sites, and we're talking about buildings, things like artifacts, manuscripts, woodworking, furniture, clothing, those sites and those physical forms of heritage are connected to intangible heritage. And that is all of the training, the education that goes along with making and transmitting those forms of communal identity over historical time. And I think the Turkish state understands quite well that destruction of heritage or appropriation of heritage, renaming of local street names, town names, omitting any references to, in the case of Cyprus, terms like Greek or Christian. We see that, of course, all over Turkey as well. Using sites as tourists, repurposing them as tourist sites, or alas, for military storehouses or as barns for animals. Imagine a sacred space having animals in it now. I think that the Turkish state understands that that's a means of erasing memory. It's the everyday erasure of memory. And in many ways, it's the everyday undermining of hope. Because if memory also acknowledges trauma, it also is a way to move beyond the trauma and to create hope for a better future. And I think Tuba's work on heritage underscores this, that it's not only about memory to recognize trauma, it's about using memory as a tool to construct a new future, and one that is free of the kind of fear that she mentioned, where people are fearful of being discriminated against. People are fearful of societal hostility. People are fearful of the future for their children. And so heritage becomes an incredible source of both living memory and hope for the future.
Well, Tuba, I want to turn back to you and, look, because Elizabeth mentioned, the fear, the hope for the future. And it seems like that hope right now is kind of being trampled on at least in Turkey with the latest crackdown, the arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu. Are you worried that this authoritarian turn by Erdogan will impact Turkey's minorities as well?
Let me actually start by explaining why I think President Erdogan is so fearful of Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu. Ekrem İmamoğlu demonstrated time and time again how municipalities, how local governments can actually make a difference. He gave a warm embrace to all citizens, independent of their religious backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds. He was an inclusive leader. He was helping heritage thrive. He was helping people express themselves. He was celebrating Passover. He was celebrating Easter. He was somebody who had the potential to bring people together. He is somebody who has the potential to build peace. And that was something that made him a target of Erdogan. It's in most authoritarian regimes, this is the kind of hope that you want to dim, because you don't want to give hope to people that they can live together and thrive together. And seeing this as Erdogan's biggest fear actually gives me hope that there is support for such leaders who have embraced everybody, who are not afraid of celebrating differences, who's not afraid of building something into the future by acknowledging the traumas and mistakes of the past. So I think as much as we are all devastated with this turn, this authoritarian turn, I see a lot of hope in it as well.
Ambassador, as we approach the end of our discussion here, in a recent interview or in the past, you've stated that authoritarian regimes are all about eliminating religious freedom. To them, essentially, it's an existential threat. Given that fact, where do you see, what are some of the things that you're going to be looking out for on the horizon when it comes to international religious freedom issues? And, where do you see the Trump administration really leaning in?
I see them leading in on reestablishing human rights globally that have been in decline for 20 years. And we need to relaunch this whole project, relaunch it, as I mentioned earlier, around the UN agreement and religious freedom as a cornerstone. And I think we just really need to elevate this point that the authoritarians generally either use religion or they want to eliminate it altogether, as in the case of China. And this is a fight that is going on right now. It's going on in Myanmar, where the churches are being attacked by the military junta backed by the Chinese and the Russians. This is a very active, hot war that's taking place today.
Nadine, what are you seeing on, in DC on the congressional side that, makes you think that this is an issue that's going to be taken much more seriously, at least by Congress?
Yeah, so I have definitely seen Congress speaking into issues on places like Syria. We just had 2 congressmen visit actually Damascus while I was in northeast Syria. But on issues like Nigeria and others, we're seeing hearings, a lot of attention to religious freedom issues. And I think it's important for people to understand that, the State Department's goal is diplomacy. And so it's really hard for them to take on a country over a religious freedom violation without some sort of pressure that they can point to. And that's the important, Congress plays an important role, as does USERF, as does civil society, in raising that pressure. And so sometimes people will think it's adversarial to the administration, and that's simply not true. What happens is when Congress raises pressure, like on what's going on in Nigeria or in Syria or Turkey, and then the administration can go back to that country and say, wow, we're getting so much pressure from Congress. You need to answer this, or you need to stop this. Or it really does give the State Department some more tools for how they can use diplomacy to further religious freedom. So it's all the way the system works. And Congress has been a really strong supporter of religious freedom. And we need them to continue to do that. But this is definitely how it works. And that's why it's important that we all speak up. and build that pressure when we see policy changes that need to be made.
On this note, I want to turn us to our shot clock segment. As all our viewers know, we like to wrap up our episode with a shot clock, just like in the NBA. All of our guests will have a chance to answer one question. They'll have 24 seconds. And Ambassador, I'm going to pass you the ball and you get the first shot. What's one thing that you'd like to see from the United States on international religious freedom, especially in the Middle East, Turkey, and this region?
Well, the one thing I would really like to see is in our growing Cold War with China, that we would point out the clear differences of view on religious freedom, that we believe religious freedom is a base human right, and they believe it's an existential threat. And I think we need to drive that around the world and point that out to all religions everywhere.
All right. Tuba, I'm passing you the ball. You're up.
All right. Building up on Ambassador Brownback, I would like to see a lot more human rights focused international foreign policy.
Unfortunately, the time doesn't pass on to the next guest, so you don't get plus 10. Elizabeth, you're up. Same question.
Great, 24 seconds. I think one important and relatively doable policy change from the U.S. is in renegotiating MOU's Memoranda of Understanding on Cultural Heritage Protections in the Greater Middle East to ensure that religious minority communities, as required by U.S. law, are involved in the renegotiation of those memoranda.
With that, I want to thank you all for joining us for this great chat on international religious freedom. And to our audience that's watching, give us a share, leave us a comment, let us know what you think. Thanks again.